Welcome, everyone. My name is Chaumtol Huq. I'm the editor of Law at the Margins, and we're really proud today to host our first Google. Before I introduce our speaker today, in which we'll have a conversation, I wanted to just share a little bit about sort of the vision and purpose of Law at the Margins. And then we're going to get into the topic around resilience, supporting each other's community work, and really hopefully get into a conversation about that. I want to let everyone know that while you'll be observing the screen, you can use the Q&A functions to ask Deepa or myself any question during the conversation. And that Q&A function should be on the left-hand side of the screen. So Law at the Margins is a social media platform, and it is intended to amplify voices of our community around issues of law and social justice. And one of the ways in which Law at the Margins does that is we have a website, lawatthemargins.com. It is a collectively and volunteer run, so I write, but I also welcome contributions from folks, so please reach out for that. And then we host Facebook, Twitter, and this time the Google Hangout to really have an engaged conversations around issues that are raised. And I like this format because it's intimate. It allows us to really have a on-the-ground conversation. And so we're very happy to have Deepa Iyer today to launch our first full many on Google on-air Hangouts. So Deepa, for some of you who may know, is the former executive director of South Asian Americans Leading Together. It's a national nonprofit organization elevating the voices of South Asian Americans. She's currently a writer and activist in residence at University of Maryland. And she is working on a book, soon to be released in 2015, which I hope she will talk a little bit about, on the new racial landscape. So I want to welcome Deepa today, and thank you for launching our first Law at the Margins Google Hangout.
Thank you, Chaumtol. It's an honor to be with you and everyone else.
And before we just jump into the conversation, I want to thank Albert Garcia, who's been consulting me on this a little bit of social media site. I'm a little bit of a newbie, so any errors, please, forgive me for that. But hopefully, as we do this more often, we'll all get the hang of it. So, Deepa, why don't we jump in and start with, I mean, most people are aware of your work, but give us a little bit of a trajectory of your social justice work, how long you've been engaged in it. Why don't we begin with there?
Sure. So before I get started, I just wanted to say thank you again to you, Chaumtol, and Law at Margins for really generating some important content for us to be thinking about online, but also for starting this particular series. And you are such an inspiration for so many of us. So thank you for curating this. And so just to get started, I think that in terms of my own kind of background in social change work, I have to say that I didn't really have a vision for it when I got started in it. Like many people, I had gone through school, gone to law school, and it was during my experience at a law firm right after law school where I realized that I really was not in a space doing the work that spoke to me. And so I started to think about, well, what does that look like for me? And I realized that a lot of that ended up going back to my own experiences as an immigrant moving to Kentucky when I was 12 years old, really starting to think about issues of race and how they played out. And so by luck, I was able to get a job as a staff attorney at a national Asian American organization in Washington, D.C., and that really kind of launched my career as well as my understanding of what social change work means to me. But it was really September 11th, 2001 that was a watershed moment for me. And at the time, I was an attorney at the Department of Justice, and I quickly began to realize that for South Asian communities, we just didn't have the infrastructure at the national or local levels to push back against the tide of discrimination, profiling, anti-immigrant policies that our communities were enduring. And so I tried to help to shape a national organization called SAALT with a lot of other people around the country, and was fortunate and privileged to have led that organization for nearly 10 years. So that has been the scope of the work that I have done so far.
And it's been, did I do the tally right? I mean, it's been almost 15 years and maybe longer that you've been engaged in this work around social justice and civil rights. I don't want to, I'll keep it vague, so the length of it, but it's been a long time. So can you share with us, which is good, this is the reason why you're our expert on sustaining social justice activism.
Hardly.
And so why don't you share with us, over your time period, what is one of your successes, one of the things you feel most proud of? I think you talked a little bit about stewarding and leading SALT as a founder. And then you recently, I thought, which folks may not know this, but should know this, which I'm sure you won't say because you're very modest, is that you managed a really, I thought, a very thoughtful transition to a new executive director. I mean, you could have presumed in that position. But share with us one success that you think people should know of, and then we'll go to maybe one challenge that you think that we still need to address.
Sure. So I'll talk a little bit about a success both organizationally or community-wide, but also personally. I think that one success has been the ability of the folks that worked at SALT over the past 10 years to help to shepherd a national network of organizations all around the country that work directly with South Asian communities. So these are groups like Drum in New York and Adhikar, to groups in Chicago, such as the Indo-American Center or Upnagar, to groups in California, like the South Asian Network. And these groups have come together with SALT to kind of form a national network that really addresses issues affecting our communities through a progressive social change lens. And I think that has been something that I personally feel very proud of as far as being part of it. And I think that that has really helped our community gain some traction at the local and national levels. Another kind of success, I would say, it's a work in progress, is I think, my own understanding that this work is really messy. A lot of times we're in relation to one another, right? And we're doing work that means something to us. And so I've had to really play against my strengths in trying to have messy, difficult conversations, whether that's with allies, whether it's with staff, whether it's with people in the community, and also holding myself accountable and having those messy conversations with myself. So that has been a work in progress that I've learned a lot from. Challenges, I think, one of the larger challenges is the climate we're in, and we can talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but I think beyond that, I think there is the challenge that a lot of our community organizations are in, which is that we're doing this work with very few resources. A lot of the organizations, at least in the South Asian Arab Muslim Sikh community space, are new. Most of them are really post 9/11 oriented and have been working in crisis. And so how can we support these organizations and these leaders for the long run as we head to this new American racial landscape? What will their role be, their space be? I think those are questions that we still need to grapple with.
I just want to, before we do move on to sort of going into the current landscape which you mentioned, and you mentioned that in your piece, 13 years after 9/11, a reflection on resilience, which actually prompted this Google Hangout to think about how do we sustain leaders in this work. But why is this importance of building a network of local groups? I know it may seem like an obvious question to you, but national nonprofits, especially DC-based, don't always take the time to necessarily sort of build up the local chapters or give enormous amount of autonomy and leadership to the local chapters because they're developing their own sort of identity. Why did you or SAALT think that that was something that was important to do? And I know that some of that work meant that perhaps SAALT's own name or branding, took some time to sort of develop. You did a lot of sort of foundational work. So can you speak to why you chose that course of action and what has yielded from that?
Sure. I think that, to be honest, having worked in national organizations and national spaces before, I have always been a critic of national groups sort of taking up space and not having a base of any kind, and often speaking about issues that they don't really have any connection to. And I think it's hard for national organizations to have that connection if they're working in a beltway policy space. So for SAALT, and it was not just me, but our board and our advisors and our staff in the very beginning felt that we had to take the time, and we took about 2 years to do this, to actually move around the country and co-coordinate, co-convene forums, community forums. We call them the SAALT exchanges, in different parts of the country to hear directly from folks on the ground who were either doing this work, who were organizing our community members, or who were directly impacted. And as we did that, what emerged was this sense that we all want to be connected. We understand we're in an important moment in this post-9/11 climate. We need to be connected with one another in order to learn from one another, but also to make sure that we are taking these learnings up to national policy levels and to disrupt the public narratives that had already been shaped about our communities. And so that was very important to us, to be able to be a national organization that is connected to the ground. And what has yielded from that, I think, quite a bit. I mean, I think one of the things that I feel that's that we have right now is a cohort of folks around the country who work in South Asian American communities that trust one another, that actually have relationships with each other, and that have a history of working with one another. And I think that that is something that our new executive director, Suman Raghunathan, is also building as part of her vision for the organization. So I think it's a cultural value for the organization that is important sort of in the broader framework as well.
Thank you. Let me just mention we're really happy that there are 9 folks joining us. I think it's one of those things, you can see us, we can't see you, but we wanted to give you a shout out for joining us on our first Google, Law of the Margins first Google On Here Hangout. One technical thing, some of you have maybe not clicked on the video, which should be a little icon on the top. So maybe you're not able to see us but hear us. So please do that. And on the left-hand side, there's a Q&A function. So please use that so that our host, Albert, can field those questions to me as the moderator, and I can make sure that Deepa, well, I'll pose it to Deepa for it to answer. And the other thing is, you can tweet to @Deepa Iyer and @Law of the Margins. And we're not live tweeting for this session because we want to really keep the conversation going. But afterwards, we'll be able to respond to some of the tweets. So please keep it coming, and so that we can really engage and really spread the conversation. So Deepa, let's move to, you talked earlier about the landscape has changed post 9/11, and that's had you to rethink, and you wrote about in your article, 13 years after 9/11, a reflection on resilience. You have to rethink our concept of resilience. So maybe you can share where are we now in terms of the landscape, what's changed, and what do you mean we need to rethink resilience?
Sure. So I'll start a little bit about the landscape first, and I'm sure that folks are very aware of this as well. But every year around 9/11, I get asked, have things gotten better? Have things changed? And honestly, every year I say no. But what has happened, I think, has been an ebb and flow. So in the years right after 9/11, we saw unprecedented levels of hate violence, 1,300% increase in anti-Muslim crimes in 2003, for example. And then it sort of ebbed a little bit. And then in 2010, we saw it spike again. This was around the Park 51 Center controversy, the beginning and spread of the anti-mosque movement in this country, to the rise in xenophobic rhetoric that SAALT has been tracking for years now and just released a report just last month about the ongoing rise of xenophobic rhetoric by political leaders and what that means, what kind of climate that creates in this country. We saw the hate violence at the Oak Creek Gurdwara in 2012. We see ongoing surveillance of Muslim communities. And so this kind of climate that we're in right now is one that really has a number of factors that shape it. It's anti-immigrant, it's anti-Muslim, and I think that has to be framed very clearly that it's anti-Muslim. It does affect others who might be perceived as Muslim, but it's really directed at Muslims. And it also comes with a lot of racial anxiety about the fact that communities of color are occupying and reshaping our landscape in America. And so these kind of three forces have really affected South Asian, Muslim, Arab, and Sikh communities in a way that has never happened before. So that's kind of the climate that we're in. But at the same time, I think it's really important to remember that we also have been able to seed and foster and generate tremendous resistance. So whether that's in the form of the organizations around the country, some of whom I mentioned, whether it's in the form of people writing and disrupting the narratives about our communities, whether it's in the form of folks taking a public office. So we have been able to seed, I think, a lot of resistance, but we still have a long way to go. But with that, history of community crisis is that topic of resilience, right? What does it mean for us to continue to hold on to that resilience? What does it take?
So in terms of the resistance that's happening to some of the issues that you mentioned impacting the South Asian community and the immigrant community, and I think we can probably broaden it to most issue areas. And as a labor advocate myself and civil rights advocate, you see a lot of retrenchment in a number of areas. And so I think that one of the things I definitely feel is that, well, there's so much to do. It's overwhelming, retrenchment on rights in so many areas. You name it, we can probably mention where there's been setbacks. How do those who are social justice minded, how do we keep up with all the information? How do we resist without necessarily feeling that we're burning out, we're not being effective? I feel like that's where the issue of resilience really comes into importance here. So can you speak to a little bit of about that? How do we sort of manage all of these? It seems like we're in crisis mode. How do we manage all of these retrenchment of rights?
So I don't, of course, know the answers to that entirely, and I'm hoping that we can generate some of that with the Q&A and in the future. But I think that there are two strands of resilience that come up when we're talking about the sector that we're in. So one is, well, first let's talk about community resilience, right? I think that there's this sense that people of color communities need to overcome, shoulder, absorb crisis and racism, and then move on, find a way to move on, right? And I think that there is also, because we are in survival mode, and then I think that there's also in our sector, in the nonprofit culture particularly, there is this sense of individual resilience, which is this thing of, it's going to be hard, but you have to compromise and sacrifice because it's for a larger cause. And really thinking about not yourself, but about the folks that you're affecting, right? And so I think that these cultural norms, if you want to call them cultural norms, can have a toll on people. And I think for me, the way that this has come up is that since I left SAALT in January, I've had the privilege of having kind of a reflection period of sort. And what I realized is that I carried a lot of anxiety in order to be so resilient, if that makes sense. So in order to be resilient in terms of being an executive director who's building an organization and dealing with a lot of the same concerns all executive directors do, I think, which is, are we going to make payroll? What about staff tension? you know, building the organization. So that happens generally and comes with anxiety, and you have to kind of push through it. But then there was also a lot of responses to crisis situations that I think is unique to our communities in particular, or immigrant communities in particular. So the 9/11, post 9/11 responders, right? If you're always kind of going uphill, and you're always kind of dealing with, you know, the Gurdwara got attacked. There is a policy that's targeting people of Middle Eastern and South Asian descent. There are ads going up in the subway in New York that are anti-Muslim. You know, if there's constantly kind of these crisis moments, what kind of toll does that take? Or there are dear colleagues and friends who are being targeted themselves. So what toll does that have on folks? So if you're somebody who looks like the people who are getting targeted all the time, and you're working with those communities, what does that mean for you? If you are of the same faith as folks who are trying to resist and push against anti-mosque movement, what does that mean for you? So I think that those questions of bearing witness and amplifying stories came up for me quite a bit. And I think there's this tendency that we shouldn't talk about that, right? Because it's privilege in a way to kind of talk about that because there's so many other things happening. But I do think that it's important for us, in order to sustain in the long run, that we do need to put in some vocabulary and practices to deal with, you know, the survival mode so that we can become more resilient.
I want to actually, before we continue on this conversation around survival and resilience, thank Chitra, Iyer, Nadia, who I'm seeing, and at Kaden and at Soya Jung, who've been tweeting away during this session. So I want to also encourage folks who are listening to please, you know, give us a question for Deepa. I mean, obviously, I have questions, but this Hangout responds to the questions that you have. So I do have one question that I see, Deepa, so I'm going to go to that before we continue the conversation, which is, social justice organizations often concentrate around one leader, charismatic leader, who's known for that work and gets identified for that work. How do you think leadership can be shared by other folks in the community?
Yeah, I think that that is a tremendous challenge, and it happens, I think, with a lot of smaller nonprofits. There's this cult of personality that occurs in the nonprofit sector, where leaders, quote leaders, are expected to be kind of the end-all, be-all spokesperson, the charismatic media person, and they're also supposed to be a visionary. And I think there's tremendous pressure that's often placed upon this person. It comes from, you know, it's a cultural piece in the sector. I think it comes from finding emerging leaders, from supporting them, right? There are a lot of these kinds of coded terms around leadership that I think actually places folks in a situation that's often untenable. And so in order to change that, I think we have to call it out for what it is, right? A cult of personality leadership does not necessarily reflect community leadership. And so what are different models? Are there co-director models that we can explore, and will funders support that? Are there models of having, you know, different people in your organization actually be the media contact? So it is not always the executive director. I think it's important to start to explore those types of options in the nonprofit sector so that we don't actually continue to perpetuate this cult of personality model that exists right now.
So that question was from Kritika Ghosh, so thank you, Kritika, for that question. The next question comes from Kaden Mack. How does imagination factor into the way we practice resilience?
Now, Kaden, that is a deep question. Kaden Mack with 18 million rising. I'm not sure I know the answer to that. I'd love to know what you think, Kaden. But I think that there are ways that we can practice resilience in the nonprofit sector in a couple of different ways, and I wanted to share that. Imagination might well be that. But I think that, you know, we talk a lot about self-care, and I think it's a word that's thrown around a lot in our sector and with social change activists. But I think we have to kind of unpack what that really means, right? So from an institutional standpoint, we have employee manuals all the time that we write up, and we have shared agreements, and this is our culture, and this is what it looks like. And so I think one way is to start thinking about what self-care looks like. Does it mean that everyone gets every other Friday off? Does it mean that there's a policy of telecommuting that gets to be followed? Does it mean that, you know, the organization hires a masseuse to come in once a month? You know, there's an ice cream break that happens, right? So there are different ways in which we can play and kind of do self-care that's collective as well as individual, but I think organizations have to make an articulate commitment to that. I think funders and stakeholders can support too, you know, short-term sabbaticals for organizers, for executive directors, for folks working in nonprofits, regardless of where they are in their tenure, right? So you get to a certain point, and then you can get like a 3-week sabbatical. These are ways that we can use to actually, I think, support folks to build that sort of resilience without it really taking a toll on them in terms of the work that they're doing. And I'm sure there are many other suggestions as well out there.
I think one of the things that you raised is self-care, and some of the things you mentioned is around collectivizing the care. I think that oftentimes when we talk about burnout, exhaustion, overwhelming, folks are said, let's take go to therapy, yoga. It's very individualized, and not to diminish that. That's a very important part of our individualized care. I just want to talk about collective way institutions can engage in care, which I think we've been talking about as we care, to collectivize that. And I just want to amplify that a little bit because I think that's really important so that institutions are not off the hook. And you talked about funders, nonprofit organizations. Are there other ways in which we can think about institutionally and systemically to reimagine care? And I'm going to ask that in the context of another question by Nadia Hussein. We're going to see enormous increases in anti-Muslim sentiment. Mm-hmm. SAALT report showed that views on Muslim Americans are actually worse after 9/11. So the community that has been resisting and been resilient is going to really need a lot in the years, and collectively, all communities, not just Muslim Americans. So it seems that we need more than just self-care. We're going to really need to systemize the care. And so I think if you could speak to that in the context of our work. And the last thing I want to mention, we had planned to do this until 8:30, but I think if it's okay, and there's still questions coming, let's go for a little bit, 15 more minutes, and because I think that this is a really important conversation. And I have 3 more questions, and I encourage folks, if you have questions, to ask that now, and before we sort of slowly wind down.
Yeah, no, Chaumtol, I think that the way that you reframed it is right on point, and I think that it's so we talked a little bit about the institutional ways, right, in which we can practice self-care through articulating it as part of kind of the shared culture of an organization, having funders support leadership. But I also think that Nadia's point is really important because I think Nadia is talking to community care because folks that are on the front lines that are experiencing the tremendous, anti-Muslim sentiment, xenophobia, anti-immigrant sentiment, are folks that are dealing with, in Murfreesboro, I can't, all of a sudden, the mosque that I thought I could go to can't get built because there are people that have descended upon Murfreesboro saying that Muslims are terrorists, right? I mean, there are children that are being bullied in the schools in Murfreesboro because that mosque is getting built. I mean, these are some of the conversations that I've been having with folks in Murfreesboro, just to pick that as an example. And that has tremendous impact on kind of how you think of yourself. It can range from a child wanting to change their name to wondering if they should wear a hijab or turban one day, if they're going to the airport or to school. So there are a lot of these questions, I think, in our community, the South Asian Muslim Arab Sikh communities in particular, around collective trauma or collective impact in the post 9/11 climate. And I do not think that we have scratched the surface in terms of understanding what that means for folks. I really appreciate Nadia's point around community care. So as we talk about self-care for activists and 9/11 responders, so to speak, in this climate, that has to also be framed in this larger context of how do we take care of our communities as a whole, who are dealing with or kind of coming of age in a generation where all they've known is a post 9/11.
Hello?
I can hear you.
Yeah, sorry. So let's start to, I don't hear any other questions, but I do want to reference this quote that was tweeted by Soya, which I thought was really powerful. Resistance is crucial. Resilience is crucial. I think that we need to both resist and to be resilient and set up institutional responses to that. So as we wind down, you talked about it throughout our conversation, but can you give us some more ways? I mean, we know individualized ways of self-care. So I want to focus more on responses to the community work to deal with the exhaustion, the burnout, to ensure that we can do this work day to day. I can't tell you, not a day goes by that I am asked, you know, Chaumtol, you've been involved in economic justice work for 15 years. How do you sustain this work? How do you do it? And so this is actually one of the reasons why Law at the Margins wanted to have this to be a launching pad, because of our discussion is we have to be able to put structures in place to sustain our work. Yeah. So can you share with us concretely what each of us who are listening, what could we do, what could we take back to our respective communities to begin to set up the building blocks for that?
I think the broad frame is that sustainability in this work has to be a collective effort. That while, yes, you know, each of us can do what we need to do to take care of ourselves, we need to have a culture of actually being able to say at an institution, at a nonprofit, at a community meeting, at an organizer's convening, that collectively we care about each other's health, about each other's emotions, about the impact that this work is having on us. So I think first we have to kind of articulate that as a collective goal and a collective shared agreement. And then I think there are some systemic and institutional practices we can put into play. So some that I've already talked about are short-term sabbaticals, having sort of articulated practices around telecommuting, around taking time as an organizational staff to actually engage in play. I know that at SAALT we try to do that a lot. We would do these fun afternoons or fun Fridays, I think they were called, where we would try to kind of come up with an idea to get the staff engaged and get them out of the space that they were in and get to know each other in a different way. Or if it is around making sure that there's time off. You know, at SALT we had a practice of kind of having a day off every month that doesn't go towards, you know, your vacation days, right? So there are different things that I think can be put into place. And then I think we also have to, when funders and others talk about leadership development, we need to press on that a little bit. What, you know, leadership training and leadership development, what does that mean? It can't happen unless there's also this sense of being able to understand this concept of survival mode, often working in crisis, trauma stewardship, and resilience. And so those conversations have to be part and parcel of any sort of leadership training, leadership development work.
So we do have two more questions, and I think we're going to wrap up with that and some closing. And in that, though, in answering those questions, if you can weave in, you talked about the systemic parts, assuming that someone is a paid staff of a nonprofit. But many folks do social justice work on a voluntary basis. They're not paid. Right. So if you talk about institutional responses, if you can speak to that group of folks who may not have a paid sabbatical, they're doing some volunteer basis. But the two questions, one from Chitra is about fundraising. How does fundraising work look like that is collective and resilient? Is there a nonprofit structure that is better, sustains our community work? And then from Soya, we have a different question, but similar in terms of how does trauma play out in the work that we do? And what's the cost of not doing everything you said we should be doing?
Right.
Seems like a lot of work. What's the cost of not doing this?
Mm-hmm. Well, the Chitra's question, I think that question about whether the nonprofit structure is inherently non-resilient is really great question to ask. The nonprofit sector has so many problems with it, as we know. It's a structure that doesn't necessarily lend itself to taking care of ourselves, to practicing the work that we do inside, right? Those are a lot of criticisms that nonprofit structures have. And yet I feel like we kind of, and that cult of personality piece that Kritika brought up earlier, I think we still kind of perpetuate these pieces in our nonprofit structures because of lack of resources, because there are no other models. So I think that we really need to, from a structural standpoint, taking a big step back, really re-examine whether the structures that we are in, the 501c3 nonprofit structures, really actually are the right ones in terms of working on behalf of particular communities or in particular communities. And that's a much bigger question, and perhaps there will be another Google Hangout about that. But to Soya's question, which I think is really it's really moving to me in particular. I mean, when Soya asks what's the cost to the movement of not doing self-care, I mean, I think that means that people burn out and people get tired, And I'll just say from my own experience, it was when the shooting happened at the Gurdwara in Oak Creek in 2012, and I was out there shortly thereafter and have spent some time there over the past number of years. I realized that for me there was some sort of trigger around that moment that was also connected to 9/11. And for me, those two experiences have been bookends in a way of understanding not only what has happened in our communities, but also understanding how I have either absorbed or dealt with or not dealt with some of the trauma of bearing witness and working deeply with communities. And so I think that what happens if you can't talk about that because you feel that, well, how can I privilege my experience of that, right, over people that are actually losing their loved ones? There's no space that we have created, I think, in order to even draw that out. And when we don't, and if we kind of push it aside over and over and keep getting up and doing the same thing, I think it does take a toll. And so of burnout, exhaustion, leaving entirely. And then we lose folks, right, that actually need to stay for 15, 20, 50 years because they've got the institutional memory and the knowledge of their communities. So I do think these interventions are necessary. The conversations are necessary, the spaces to have them, to be vulnerable is necessary, and then the interventions at an institutional level are extremely critical in order for us to make resilience something that feels good rather than being about survival mode.
Great, thank you. So we are going to slowly wind down. I am overjoyed. I think we wanted to do a half-an-hour session, thinking that the worst-case scenario. Deepa and I, who I adored and respect tremendously for her commitment to social justice work over the years, that at most will be two friends having a conversation. But I'm just been really delighted that we've been joined by a number of folks. And been tweeting it and asking some really compelling questions, which we hope that we can maybe continue to both go onto Twitter, which is at Deepa Iyer and at theMargins. Also, theMargins has a Facebook page, and so if there are any questions that you have or conversations that you'd like to have, it's really that, because as I mentioned earlier, we like to host this on a regular basis with various speakers. So I think the more that we know sort of what's your interest would be helpful. So in closing, I just wanted to thank you, Deepa, for being our inaugural theMargins Google Hangout. Apologize if folks couldn't link to it or couldn't reach us. Or I'm, newbie. I'm a digital migrant, not a digital native, as I say. So I'm still learning this, but I think it's an effective tool. And so just to kind of loop back, why theMargins thinks that this is such an important venue. Social media is a really important venue by which we can reach a wider audience and to elevate voices of folks who may not have access, especially through institutionalized organizations and social justice work sometimes can get very professionalized. And I do think that social media does provide an opportunity for individual activists to connect and engage with each other. And I think that recognizing that medium is one of the reasons why I elected to use it. And so we'll continue to do that. The other thing I wanted to mention sort of in closing and give Deepa just some closing remarks is a big part of sustaining my activism is that while I'm on Google On Here, my husband Marvin Cabrera is getting my kids ready for school at 6 a.m. in Dhaka, Bangladesh. I know that Deepa Iyer has a little cutie, Ahi, and Parag Kandra, who's probably helping, while she's on air. And Albert Garcia, who you can't see, and has been the host of today, who I want to thank, has been helping me to consult on this. His darling wife and my dear friend Griselle has been also taking care of their daughter Nadia. So as you can see, a theme here that part of sustaining is really having loved ones and in our community that can allow us to sustain our families as we do this kind of work. So I want to give a shout out to those you can't see on screen and hear who aren't always on the front lines of this justice work. So with that, I want Deepa to closing remark, and then I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and I look forward to the next Google Hangout. So Deepa, just one final word of thoughts on resilience, survival, where we go from here.
So I think, just a few quick pieces. I think that one is that each of us can go back to whatever institution or community that we're in and pose this question, right? And to say that we can create a space to have these conversations, and we can also set up systems. And so I think that I would kind of call people to that kind of action in their own communities. And then I think a second piece is to really kind of reach out to one another. I know that for me in particular, the folks that I have been able to connect with over the past 15 years, and particularly after 9/11, folks like you, Chaumtol, and Linda Sarsour, and Amardeep Singh, and many others who have been on this journey have been incredibly important. So fostering those relationships, reach out and say hello to your social justice friend. I think that staying in touch and connecting in that way is also vitally important on an individual level. So collectively and individually, we can start having these conversations. We should, and then really remember that community impact is the frame that we are all working in and working towards as well. Thank you so much for having me, Chaumtol, and looking forward to more of these Google on our chats.
Yeah, great, thank you. So again, folks, make sure that you tweet to me at theMargins on any other topics you think we should discuss. And also, you can come to the Facebook page, theMargins, for any other follow-up. You want to continue the conversation. So again, thank you. And I guess for me, it's a good morning. For you guys in the in the United States, good night. And again, thank you, Albert, for hosting us for our first live Google On Air Hangout. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.